Yugoslavs are filing a formal protest with the State Department. In St. Louis, an experimental housing project run by the government failed badly, but it sounds as though just about everybody concerned with it may have learned something from the experience.
18,000 persons once lived in St. Louis's Pruitt-Igoe project. Now these remaining buildings, waiting for demolition, stand as the biggest public housing failure in government history, a $38 million disaster. Built in the 1950s, the Pruitt-Igoe project ran at $1 million a year deficit. It was simply unmanageable. Crime, vandalism, tenant rebellion, management failure, all contributed to the project's destruction. Not even a final, desperate plan could save the project. The blowing up of selected apartments so that surrounding tenants could have more space to live. But out of the chaos at Pruitt-Igoe has come a new idea on how to manage housing for the poor. Let the poor do it themselves. The concept is called tenant management, now an experiment for 2 years here, involving 4 projects. In each of the projects, the tenants have elected a board of directors, who in turn set management policies and hire a project manager. Rent collections, maintenance, leases, all the details of real estate management are handled by the tenant manager and his staff. The result? There is grass where there were once dirt lots. Painting chores don't go unattended. Broken windows are boarded, then replaced. The goal is to clean up slum life through self-management. The Department of Housing and Urban Renewal is watching the St. Louis experiment closely. If it's considered a success, the program could be implemented across the country in other housing projects. And success here depends on tenant support.
Do you think this system works better than, say, old landlords that you've had in the past?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because they wouldn't fix up the house or rain or leaking or nothing. To tell you, they didn't have no money. They wasn't going to fix it. Cost too much money.
The crime rate here is high, but not as high as it once was, thanks to constant patrols. Some 50 of the guards have been recruited from the projects. Troublemakers are now in the minority, but they are still a problem.
60% of the residents in Peabody are working and cooperating with the tenant management concept. 20% of them are sitting by waiting to see which way the corporation is going to go, and the other 20% are the hardcore persons that are against it or not doing anything to help it.
The St. Louis Housing Authority serves as a kind of holding company for the tenant-managed projects. It approves budgets, offers computer services. The rest is up to the tenant managers and their boards of directors. 85% of the persons in the experiment are on welfare, yet rent collections range from 96 to 100%. The management employees drawn from the projects earn a minimum of $3.50 an hour. But even more important than jobs, tenant management has given the poor here control of the way they live. Larry Pomeroy, CBS News, St. Louis.
The time now, 19 minutes.
The drug war know that one of its battlegrounds will be the nation's public housing, which in many cases has been taken over by gangs, dealers, users. We continue our CBS News coverage of drugs, one nation under siege. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Jack Kemp joins us live from Washington. In Chicago, Vince Lane, the chairman of the Chicago Housing Authority. And in Philadelphia, Kimmy Gray, chairperson of the Tenants Board that runs a public housing project. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm sure you all listened to the speech last night, or at least read about it in the paper this morning. Mr. Kemp, do you have what you need now?
Well, the president outlined last night, I think, a national call to arms here. And from my standpoint, the new $50 million for public housing is a good beginning for fiscal year 90. There's other monies that can be used in the Community Development Block Grant, the CAP monies for Comprehensive Improvement Assistance Program, and public housing subsidies. But the type of things that Vince Lane has done in Chicago, Bob Armstrong, the local authority in Omaha, and Kimmy Gray, working with tenants, I believe on behalf of the 3.5 million tenants in public housing in America, not only can we win this war, but we can clean up public housing in America.
Vince, how is this going to affect you?
Well, I'll tell you, I was surprised to hear that we did get $50 million allocated to public housing. I've stated before Congress that with about $30 million here in Chicago, I can clean up every troubled high-rise in the city. So the money will be very much appreciated here in Chicago.
Do you feel like you have the support from the federal government you need, Vince?
Well, you know, I think what was important yesterday was the president took a position. And what he essentially said was the will of the American people are going to have to take hold in this war on drugs. And what he essentially did, even though more money could have been utilized, he's thrown down the gauntlet and challenged local communities to reallocate funding to fight the scourge of drugs in our communities.
Kimmy, you're really on the front lines of this battle and have been on the front lines for years now. Do you think the president understands the magnitude of the problem? Do you think the American people understand the magnitude of it now?
I think that now that the president has made a statement on the problem, that persons will become more aware of what's happening now, especially in public housing properties. As you're well aware, it was a war declared on public housing some time ago. But now in public housing, as we state, the president has put his money where his mouth is. And we believe that with the sum that has come to us, that we will see more progress being made. And we also that understand that under commitment and sensitivity of the president and also Secretary Kemp, that some action will be actually taken now, and instead of all the rhetoric that we've been hearing.
Kimmy's made progress. Vince appears to be making progress in Chicago. Mr. Kemp, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of other projects around the country that are quite literally hellholes still, even as we speak.
Well, Harry, you're right. But again, it's on behalf of the tenants that I think the most support for this program is going to come. The president has outlined a strategy. We need the support of the public housing authorities around the country. I think they are enlisting in this war. But we have to involve the tenants themselves. And as Bill Bennett said, most tenants in public housing are not doing or dealing drugs. It's on their behalf that we've got to increase security, increase lighting, increase the improvement of the units, and ultimately make sure that we take out of public housing those who are using subsidies to involve their families in drugs or their people in drugs, and through prompt eviction by taking away Section 8 certificates and subsidies from public housing residents, those who abuse it, we can make public housing work on behalf of the people, not those who are taking advantage of that taxpayer subsidy.
All right, we're going to take a break right now and continue our look at public housing, the front line in the war against drugs. It's 16 minutes before the hour. We'll be back in just a bit. We continue our look at one of the major battlegrounds in the drug war, America's public housing. With us from Washington is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Jack Kemp, in Chicago, Vince Lane at the Rockwell Gardens Public Housing Project, the chairman of the Chicago Housing Authority, and in Philadelphia, Kimmy Gray, the chairperson of a public housing project there. Vince, can you see down the road, can you see a day or foresee a day now that the war on drugs has officially been declared when all public housing in Chicago will be safe?
I certainly can. In fact, one of my major thrusts here in Chicago has been to prove that public housing doesn't have to be a hellhole. Here at Rockwell Gardens, in the past 12 months, we've secured all 8 high-rises, about 1,200 units. And we've now have grass and flowers. The kids can use the play lots without getting caught in the crossfire of warring gangs. Women can sit on the galleries. They can open their bedroom windows again. I definitely believe that the war that was declared on drugs by the president yesterday can lead this country to a better life for its public housing residents.
Kimmy, you've been in this battle longer than just about anybody. What do you know about this that most people in America don't? What do you know about it that they can't appreciate?
I know that over the years we have seen youth lives change because of the drugs problems that have occurred within public housing. But what has majorly taken place is that the parents now begin to understand that they must play a role in what's happening so they make a change for the environment, for their children's sake. The fight is not about so much myself or you, it's about our youth, our children. And what we've learned in Washington, D.C., and working with resident management, there's a commitment. As chairman of the National Association of Resident Management Corporations, what we have found is that it takes the residents themselves to make a commitment for change within their housing complexes. And what society has got to start seeing is not just public housing projects, but they must see public real estate lived in by low-income residents, so folk can have a different attitude about what they intend to do to better help us or assist us. We have found the residents within the housing complexes themselves now have taken a new attitude of working with the police department, of working with management, and making sure that those that are not committed to the change of environment will be evicted. And it was a hard bullet for us to swallow at first, because a lot of our children were involved in the drug pushing and the drug selling, and also bring the drugs in our community using drugs. But we realized that if we do not step forward or put a foot forward to change our environment, no one will. The commitment must come from us first, and the commitment is there now, because we are worse off than we've ever been in public housing. We've also asked Secretary Kemp to address the deterioration of our public housing. That's why the $50 million that came down last night, we're hoping will be placed in our public housing throughout the entire United States to upgrade the conditions so that we can rehab the vacant units and occupy them with families, and then there'll be no room for drug havens and crack houses and smoke houses.
Is that how it's going to go, Mr. Kemp?
Well, Kimmy Gray is really one of the leaders here in this whole effort to involve the tenants in not only managing, but ultimately what we call homesteading, the opportunity to own some public housing throughout the country. She's made it work at Kenilworth Parkside. Vince Lane has made it work in Chicago. Bob Armstrong has made it work in Omaha. I've been at Bromley Heath in Boston and been down at Liberty Square in Miami. I'm convinced that we can make it work, involving the tenants, rehabilitating the units, and making sure that we evict the drug abuser, user, and dealer.
Jack Kemp, Vince Lane, Kimmy Gray, we thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Harry.
Appreciate it. Next week, we're going to visit 5 cities from Philadelphia to San Diego, each of them, in one way or another, fighting its own war against drugs. 11 minutes before the hour. Faith?
A new report tonight warns about America's public housing for the poor and lack of same. The government has failed to spend millions earmarked for needed repairs, and for more and more people who live in housing projects, it's no place to call home. Scott Pelley has a case in point.
On a street named Desire, New Orleans public housing crumbles.
Jesus have mercy.
How many of your apartments look like this?
Over half of them. Over probably about 1,000.
Deborah Davis watches her neighborhood fall to decay and danger.
She fell over in it, and it was a day or so when we found her. Her name was Hezakya.
She drowned in the pool.
The Desire housing development is part of what is being called a national disgrace. Across America, public housing is in ruins, even though millions in federal housing money is just sitting in Washington unspent. The blame lies with local housing authorities that the feds believe are too inept to spend the money wisely.
Typically, the boards are appointed by mayors or city councils. The idea is to keep the control local and eliminate waste and fraud as much as possible. But critics charge too often these local boards are simply incompetent.
I just think there are some people that think niggas are too dumb to run this house.
The New Orleans board, with its chairman who fancied baseball uniforms, failed to spend more than $60 million it was entitled to. In all, 23 troubled public housing agencies neglected to spend $1.6 billion in housing money over the last 5 years. Today in Washington, the National Commission on Severely Distressed Housing recommended professional help for local authorities that can't seem to get the money to the poor.
Don't just cut the housing authorities off. Find a way to get that money in through some competent personnel.
In New Orleans, federal officials forced out the old board.
What has 15 years of neglect like this done to the people in your neighborhood?
Scarred them emotionally, brought down their self-esteem.
At Desire, the failure to spend the money has created a generation lost in the shuffling paper of the bureaucracy. Scott Pelley, CBS News, New Orleans.
Cities is trying to deal with an explosion of random, senseless killings. Yesterday, the city unveiled a plan to fight drug dealing and violent crime in public housing. The ground floors of 160 high-rises will be cleared of tenants and sealed to prevent weapons from being brought in. And Chicago Mayor Richard Daley has ordered more police sweeps to confiscate weapons.
These are not used for pheasant or squirrel hunting in Lincoln Park. These are basically to control the narcotics trafficking in this nation. That's the only thing it's used for.
The action was sparked by last week's shooting death of a 7-year-old in a public housing project plagued by violence.
And finally, an unwelcome
Housing for the
delivery.
poor is an especially controversial issue tonight in 2 American cities. In Dallas, a middle-income neighborhood is fighting plans for a public housing project. More about that in a moment. But first, Frank Courier reports from Chicago, where the U.S. government has just seized control of the local public housing authority.
Today's takeover in Chicago makes the federal government landlord of America's poorest, most crime-infested public housing projects. Housing Secretary Henry Cisneros came to town to lead the charge.
There will be no interruption in security or in services that the residents have a right to expect.
An impatient Mayor Daley welcomed HUD's seizure of public housing after years of trying to control what some here call Chicago's high-rise hellholes. At projects like Cabrini Green, police sweeps drew national attention to a crackdown on gang snipers and drug dealers. Controversial raids that netted hundreds of weapons.
You have to have sweeps. The people, the residents want it.
The sweeps.
Housing Authority Chairman Vince Lane was once called a visionary hero by President Clinton, but his vision to tear down high-rise ghettos to build low-rise townhomes stalled in bureaucracy.
It's 20 years of mismanagement, 20 years of corruption, 20 years of decrepit construction. That's not going to be turned around overnight.
With broken elevators, leaky ceilings, and squalid living conditions, many of the CHA's 90,000 low-income residents here are running low on hope.
It's bad for our kids not to be able to walk where they want to go.
Today's takeover, experts predict, may speed along a vision older than most residents here. A multi-billion-dollar plan to redevelop the most troubled public housing projects in America. Frank Courier, CBS News, Chicago.
The next stop for the federal housing reform bill passed by the House earlier this month. Its backers hope to transform public housing from the ground up. But as Eric Ingberg reports, cutting through the red tape just might be the best solution.
The oldest and worst of the nation's public housing projects built over the last 60 years are coming down. As the government pushes to replace 100,000 dilapidated units in the next 4 years. Other big changes are also on the horizon for the federally funded housing program started in the Depression. Both Congress and the White House say they want to put an end to public housing as unsightly warehousing for the poor. One popular reform is to give more initiative and autonomy to local housing officials. The idea is already working in the nation's capital.
The roofs were coming down, the windows were being broken out.
Washington's public housing was in such bad shape that a court-appointed manager, David Gilmore, was brought in to run it. That was 2 years ago. Tenants then faced crumbling buildings and runaway crime.
They used to shoot so bad around here that the bullets would hit the bricks. Everybody would have to duck down in their houses.
Gilmore's strategy sounds simple. Cut red tape. If it's broke, fix it.
We do a paint job, which is something that they probably haven't had for years. We lay down a new floor. If the kitchen cabinets function, fine. We reuse them, clean them up, and reuse them. If not, we replace them.
If it's too far gone to fix, Gilmore tears it down, using a blend of public and private funds to build new housing that can serve both the poor and working-class families. As Congress rewrites the housing laws, one issue to be settled is how many working-class families can be allowed in public housing without closing the door on the poor. However that's resolved, all sides agree they want less Washington and more local David Gilmores running the programs. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Washington.
Sad story that's all too familiar in our city. A young girl's life suddenly ended, all because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. 15-year-old Laquanda Edwards died from a gunshot wound in the back of the head. She was shot by a sniper's bullet as she left her home in Cabrini Green to go to the store. For most of us, going to the store is a routine errand. In Cabrini Green, it can be a death-defying act. Here's Channel 2's Mike Parker.
Adele, there are screams and gunfire virtually every night in the CHA housing project called Cabrini Green, and all too often the gang bangers or somebody else with a gun ends an innocent life. The good people of the project see anger and violence and blood on the pavement all the time, and they absolutely hate it. They have all the more reason when they see how their neighbors not far away live without fear. Friday evening, just before sundown in the upscale North Halstead area. Some young boys play basketball, seemingly safe from city dangers behind the iron security fence that surrounds their condo complex. People in this neighborhood tonight move easily down tree-lined streets of renovated homes, in and out of the spotless corner grocery, the trendy restaurants, and the new theater district. 7 blocks and 1,000,000 miles away is Cabrini Green. In this neighborhood, there are no trattorias, no theaters, and people move not easily, but warily. And there's a reason.
Move out of the way, please. Please, move out of the way.
In this neighborhood last night, a 15-year-old girl lay dead in the street, her skull smashed by a bullet fired by someone from somewhere in the dark. Maybe for a reason, maybe not. Her name was LaQuanda Edwards. She was in the 8th grade. Tonight, there's a heightened police presence in the area as the search for her killer goes on. People who may know something are rounded up, some taken away to be questioned. The mothers of Cabrini Green, like Juanita Daly, only wish they could bring up their kids in a neighborhood like the one 7 blocks away.
Most people that don't live here can just walk about and feel that no one's going to harm them. But here, you don't know what's the next thing's going to happen to you. You know, you may be just walking and they start shooting and you're the one get hit by the fire.
And as she looks at a birthday card she got from her daughter 2 weeks ago, LaQuanda Edwards' mother knows that all too well.
She gave me a beautiful card out of money she saved up. And I'm supposed to be giving her a ring with her initial on for her birthday.
When you talk to the kids of Cabrini Green, you get a sense of the real tragedy of all this. Almost all of them have seen people shot or dying. Often they were family members. One little girl told me tonight she has seen 3 people shot. 3 people. And she is 7 years old. Lester Nadell.
The sound of children playing. Last night, it was cut short by the sound of gunfire. When the bullet stopped flying, 9-year-old Anthony Felton lay bleeding on the ground. He had been waiting outside his building to go to an awards banquet for a boxing match he had recently won.
He was waiting downstairs for his coach to come pick him up. Kids came running upstairs, somebody got shot in the chest. I went downstairs, he was laying on the ground on his face.
Anthony Felton is the latest victim of gang violence. Even more shocking, police say the gang member that gunned him down was himself only 13 years old. Detectives say gangs are recruiting young kids to do the dirty work because those kids get easier sentences in juvenile homes when they're caught.
They use young people to commit certain crimes based on the fact that a young person may not be severely punished like an adult would if he in turn had, in fact, had committed a crime such as a shooting or a homicide.
Police have conducted massive raids and crackdowns on gangs and drugs at Cabrini Green. The building Anthony Felton lived in was one of those under a secure lockdown. But even that did not protect him. All his family has now are photos and trophies for the boy who loved to box, a boy who wasn't safe in his own front yard. The Felton family says it seems no place is safe for the children.
It's not over here. You won't find a place over here because anywhere you go over here, they're gonna be shooting.
These people, they don't care. They just shoot and kill. They don't care who they kill.
The shooting of 7-year-old Enfield Davis left behind a trail of grief from the public housing project where he lived to Jenner School across the parking lot where he attended first-grade classes as a special ed student.
There's no reason for this. Absolutely none. This child didn't even have a life yet, but he's laying out there and he's dead.
Enfield Davis was gunned down by a sniper's bullet as he stood with his mother outside his CHA building just as he was about to go to school only 100 feet away. Dante Hamilton was standing beside him.
I heard the shot and I ran back in the building. And then I saw him, he had got shot.
Police fanned out around this red brick building at 1157 Cleveland, where they believe the sniper fired his fatal shot. While they searched for the gunman, those who knew Enfield Davis searched for reasons for his senseless killing.
He never hurt no one. Nothing like this to happen to him. Not Danny. I heard the gunshot and I seen the little boy fall flat on his back. And I seen his mother come running and jump on top of him. And I heard her hollering. I knew that he had to get shot.
Concerned about the safety of their own children, many other parents came back to school this morning to pick up their children.
A mother who's taking a child across the street, which is really 100 feet to school, she should feel some kind of safety, and obviously she doesn't.
Inside the school, distraught students were consoled by teachers and counselors, some of whom themselves were hard-pressed to make sense of the everyday violence around them.
They feel like nobody cares. They just would like to be able to go to school and go home and be safe.
They came from Cabrini by bus. These are the children who went to school with Dantrell Davis, the people who live in his building, and among those pouring into the chapel, those who knew him best, his family.
He was a beautiful kid, even though he had been through a lot of changes. It didn't bother him. He was a happy little boy.
We're gonna do something. We're gonna change. You're not about the gang and the shooting and the killing and stuff. So we that don't be about killing and stuff, get rid of that.
Emotional pleas for change, for an end to the senseless killing, came from everyone, from church leaders.
This young man's life was a special life, and that we have to bind together and do that thing that you required of us to do, to love ye one another as you have loved us.
From the politicians and from the head of the Chicago Housing Authority, who wiped away tears as he vowed that Dantrell's death would not be in vain.
It's a symbol of what's wrong in our city today.
But as Dantrell's mother shed tears and friends cried out in pain, the real question is, will there be a difference in the lives of those getting off the bus and returning to Cabrini? People like Annette Reese say they've already seen a glimmer of hope.
Yes, since Dantrell was killed, there hasn't been any shooting. I haven't heard any shooting. So I know it will make a difference.
In what way? When you hope?
Maybe now we'll get something done. We'll have some better secure buildings.
We know today that this child has not perished, but has moved on a step higher to eternal life. And so we thank you for it, oh God. Go before us now, Lord, and make the crooked places.
Praise the
The takeover in Chicago makes the federal government landlord to America's poorest and most violent public housing projects. Housing Secretary Henry Cisneros led the shakeup.
Our first goal is to make sure that the basic services that people ought to expect from a landlord are provided.
Some have called these projects high-rise hellholes. Police sweeps here drew national attention to a crackdown on gang snipers and drug dealers. Controversial raids that netted hundreds of weapons.
You have to have sweeps.
And the people,
the residents want
the sweeps.
And no one's being abusive.
Residents want the sweeps.
Housing Authority Chairman Vince Lane was once called a visionary hero by President Clinton, but his vision to tear down the public high-rises and build smaller townhomes stalled. To many observers, not surprising.
It's not that it can't be done, but 20 years of mismanagement can't be reversed in 2 or 3 years.
With broken elevators, leaky ceilings, and filthy living conditions, many of the CHA's 90,000 low-income residents here are running low on hope.
It's bad for our kids not to be able to walk where they want to go.
And Vince Lane, who resigned after 7 years, says he'd had enough.
Government should try to get out of the housing business and let the people who provide housing for most Americans provide it for the public housing eligible families that we're supposed to serve.
Not yet. The takeover experts say may speed along a vision older than most residents here. A multi-billion-dollar plan to redevelop the most troubled public housing projects in America. Frank Courier, CBS News, Chicago.
Morning is the safest time at Chicago's Robert Taylor Housing Project, when the gunfire quiets and children can go to school. But deadly gang wars are a fact of life here.
You don't know where the shooting coming from. You know, you go out, man, your business, then pow, pow. You hear all these different gunshots, and then you don't know which way to run.
This is a 30-30 that we recovered last week.
The Chicago Housing Authority gun room holds hundreds of confiscated weapons, some taken during warrantless searches of Taylor Homes apartments. The Housing Authority's director defends those searches.
You have over 300 reports of gunfire in a concentrated period of time. That's a state of emergency.
A federal judge has ruled temporarily that the gun sweeps are illegal, but many Taylor Homes residents are more concerned about their right to live than their constitutional rights.
I want them to come and do the sweep. You know, maybe a lot of kids will stop getting shot, innocent kids will stop getting shot.
The American Civil Liberties Union is challenging the searches, saying they violate the Constitution.
Sweeps are not the answer. Adequate law enforcement, professionally trained, deployed in adequate numbers, is the only way that people in CHA housing will be safe.
Who do we want? When do we want them? Now!
This week, residents marched to reclaim their streets, and Vince Lane says no matter what the judge rules tomorrow, he's there to back them up.
I can tell you, if it happens again, I will be searching for weapons.
Many Taylor Homes residents say they're willing to give up one right in order to secure the right to live in peace. Vicki Mabry, CBS News, Chicago.
Writer Ralph Ellison died today in New York at the age of 80. His only novel, The Invisible Man, is considered one of the greatest of the 20th century. It tells of a young black man's odyssey from the Old South to Harlem and how it felt to be part of the underclass. President Clinton today again targeted gang-related crime in public housing. He unveiled another policy to allow sweeping searches for weapons without warrants. The question is whether the new policy, unlike the previous one, will survive a constitutional challenge. David Colhane has our report.
The heart of the plan is to ask tenant associations to put clauses in their leases which would authorize sweep searches for weapons in gang-ridden public housing projects around the country. The administration argues that this would counter the ruling of a federal court in Chicago that searches without warrants violate constitutional protections.
Any abstract analysis of people's rights of the type that the ACLU might do is swamped in real life by people's rights being denied. People ought to have a right to live safely.
Many residents at the Robert Taylor Housing Project in Chicago made it clear today that they would welcome any action that would reduce the drugs, gang wars, and random shootings that plague the projects.
They got to stop the shooting somehow, and maybe when they get rid of the guns, then the shooting will stop.
Secretary Cisneros visited the Taylor homes and found out firsthand from residents how bad things really are.
She was just begging that the violence, the shooting, her children having to watch their classmates be taken to the hospital, stop.
The administration also promised more police for the projects, but the searches were the main thrust of today's announcement, and some residents are voicing objections.
You know, they might be sleeping or something, and this and that, then guys rumbling into your house. You know, that stuff kind of irritates you, you know, and if you ain't got nothing in your house, it's really messed up.
The likely legal objection to the new leases is that requiring a prospective tenant to agree to searches or lose the right to an apartment would still be unconstitutional.
But the Clinton administration is clearly betting the public will be more concerned about the right to stay alive than the right to be free from unwarranted searches. David Culhane, CBS News, New York.
President Clinton gave new hope to the homeless today, offering grants and initiatives to help them find shelter. Mr. Clinton also proposed a plan to integrate the nation's 10,000 public housing projects, an initiative critics warn will mirror the furor over school desegregation. Diana Olick has more.
The president called it a holiday gift to communities like this one, sweeping reforms in public housing and $1 billion in grants for the homeless. But it's likely to be as controversial as it is expensive.
The steps we're taking now will create new opportunity for the homeless, for hard-pressed working families, and for those struggling to buy their first home.
Mr. Clinton directed public housing authorities to take stock of their buildings and to integrate them better racially and economically. The 1.3 million families already in public housing would not be forced to relocate, but new families entering the system would be placed more strategically. In New York today, the outgoing HUD secretary joined in selling the plan.
No longer will public housing be reflective of segregation, but of maximum integration and maximum choice.
The president also announced a 9% increase in FHA loan limits from $219,000 to $240,000, helping more Americans to buy their own homes. The $1 billion in grants for the homeless will go not only to housing, but drug treatment and medication, job training, and child care.
These are some of the most radical reforms in the Housing Administration's 50-year history, all ordered in the president's last few weeks on the job. But they may be just a Christmas wish. Conservative critics are already on the warpath, and a conservative president is waiting in the wings.
Well, I think what the president has done is plant a landmine that is intended to go off in the next administration. The integration of public housing is failed policy, is social engineering. It didn't work in busing.
A Bush spokesman said the new administration would review the rules and could take new action once he takes office. It would be within President-elect Bush's power to redirect the money and cancel the Clinton plan. Diana Olick, CBS News, Washington.